You are a Roman guard. The corridor smells of stone and sweat. Torches gutter in niches cut into the palace walls. Ahead, a door is sealed and watched. Inside that room, for days, a queen has been kept alive while the instruments of empire decide what story will be told about her death. If you have seen paintings, movies, or heard the poets, you likely imagine a small basket, a venomous snake, a romantic suicide that closed a drama neatly. Everything you think you know about Cleopatra's death is worth questioning. The image that endures is beautiful and simple. The reality, when we pull at the threads left in the sources, is systematic, theatrical, and in many ways far more disturbing. What follows is an evidence-anchored reconstruction of the final 10 days of Cleopatra's life. Not a lurid parade of invented facts, but a sequential reading of the actions, messages, and gestures that together formed a deliberate psychological operation. We rely on Plutarch and Cassius Dio where they are explicit, and we treat other claims as contested when the ancient record disagrees or falls silent. Our aim is to show not only how Cleopatra died, but also how Octavian, soon to be Augustus, engineered the conditions around her death, so that Rome could seize the narrative and turn a complicated political defeat into the spectacle of imperial legitimacy. If you care about how power shapes history, subscribe. This channel is committed to exposing the mechanisms behind the images we inherit. Cleopatra VII had been more than a ceremonial queen. She had ruled a cosmopolitan and sophisticated kingdom, maneuvered in Roman politics, negotiated treaties, borne children by two of Rome's most famous men, and allied herself with Mark Antony in a partnership that terrified and fascinated the Roman elite. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra was both personal and political. It was an axis around which Roman anxieties about foreign influence and Eastern prosperity revolved. Octavian, by contrast, arrived in Rome with claims to victory, but not yet unshakable legitimacy. He faced the problem faced by every emerging autocrat: how to convert battlefield success into a story that secured long-term authority. Triumphs, those ritual processions through Rome, where captives and spoils paraded through the streets, were not merely spectacles. They were public law, a performance of dominance that redefined enemies as objects of Roman display. To Octavian, the neatest way to enshrine his power was to cast Rome's civil war as a righteous struggle against an exotic corrupting monarch of the East, rather than as an internal Roman quarrel. The period we will reconstruct falls across a dozen days in August of 30th BCE. Ancient authors do not always agree on the precise hours, and some details are indefinido, meaning the sources are silent or contradictory. Where chronology is firm, we present it. Where it fractures, we mark it as contested. Our central claim is that Octavian deliberately kept Cleopatra alive, not to let her govern, but so he could stage her capture, coerce compliance, and thereby manufacture the images needed for his triumph. That campaign had several components: the separation of her children, repeated measurements and preparations for public display, staged negotiations that mixed threat with conditional promises, and carefully timed visits intended to pressure her choices. Read together, these actions look less like the gracious treatment of a vanquished sovereign, and more like the calculated apparatus of humiliation. August 1st. According to Plutarch, Antony dies following a failed attempt to take his own life after hearing false reports that Cleopatra was dead. The death of Antony collapses the military resistance and leaves Alexandria vulnerable. Plutarch's portrait is tragic: Antony mortally wounded, dying in Cleopatra's arms. Cassius Dio provides other emphases and adds color to the political context. What matters for our purposes is the swift pivot in Octavian's calculations. With Antony gone, Cleopatra remains the greatest symbol of opposition and the most valuable trophy. She must be captured intact. Her life has political utility. Plutarch records that Octavian captured Cleopatra and had her removed to one of the royal compounds. Some sources say she had barricaded herself in the tomb for a time and was later brought out. Others suggest she presided briefly over a last stand. The exact sequence can be debated, but the result is clear in the ancient accounts. Cleopatra was taken alive. August 2-4. The next days, according to several ancient testimonies, are when Octavian begins the slow work of stripping Cleopatra of the protections that could preserve her autonomy. The most chilling detail repeated in the sources is the instrumental use of her children. Plutarch explicitly mentions that her children were taken from her. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the younger Ptolemy Philadelphus, and the elder son, Caesarion, Ptolemy Phiptine, were separated and placed under Roman custody. Sources vary as to who physically carried out these separations and the exact conditions under which each child was removed. The name Proculus appears in some accounts as one of the Roman officers involved, though attribution is contested. What is beyond dispute is the function of this move. Children become both trophies and leverage. Cleopatra's attendants were also restricted. Plutarch and other writers note that she was closely guarded and watched. Builders and officials visited the palace, measuring rooms and discussing clothing arrangements. Ancient commentators describe how the Romans tested what she would wear, how she could be displayed. The image of a woman repeatedly measured is striking precisely because it reduces a living sovereign to an object of fit and fashion, an exhibit to be calibrated. Cassius Dio's tone, where he addresses these details, suggests intentionality. This was preparation for a public spectacle rather than a private act of mercy. These visitors, architects, tailors, officers, thrust the mechanics of display into the center of Cleopatra's daily life. They talked about chains and garments and the posture she would strike when led in a procession. For us, this is not mere logistical detail. It is evidence of a doctrine of humiliation. It is useful to bring a modern interpretive frame here, cautiously. What we see can be read as a patterned application of coercive leverage, an apparatus of deprivation and inducement designed to wear down resistance. Labeling this as a psychological operation is interpretive, not diagnostic. When later historians speak of conditioning or even learned helplessness, they use those terms to describe a pattern of action: systematic isolation, intermittent rewards, symbolic humiliation, rather than to clinicalize Cleopatra's mental state. The ancient sources do not provide her private thoughts. They record actions and effects. Taken together, those actions read like an orchestrated campaign to make a queen concede to a form of staged defeat. August 5-6. The next phase is negotiation with promise. Octavian is not uninterested in appearances of clemency. His political objective requires him to present himself as magnanimous. Cassius Dio and Plutarch both describe offers extended to Cleopatra. If she would come to Rome and present herself in a particular way, some sources say voluntarily rather than as a chained captive, her life might be spared and even some honors preserved. But those offers were not simple choices between life and death. They were conditional ladders, each rung designed to produce a public image that would validate Octavian's version of events. The old Roman ideal that magnanimity enhanced glory is at work here. By extending the appearance of mercy, Octavian could claim moral superiority while preparing the practical means to neutralize the Egyptian monarchy. Adding to the pressure was the continued use of her children as bargaining chips. The Romans made clear, through action and rumor, that the children's fate depended on her compliance. An especially furrowing episode in the sources, though reported with varying detail, is the brief, calculated appearance of Caesarion at the palace to plead with his mother. Plutarch reports that the sight of her eldest son briefly softened her resolve and led her to eat again after a period of fast. This moment is recorded as a private, tender scene in the midst of political theatre. A mother, starving herself in protest, brought to a state of compromise by the presence of her child. It is plausible to read that episode as part of Octavian's design, allowing a carefully staged encounter that would function as both emotional leverage and public optics. Whether Octavian personally ordered that specific meeting, or whether it occurred opportunely under his watch, its political effect was to demonstrate how effectively the Roman apparatus could weaponize familial bonds. August 7th-8. As the days progressed, Octavian's emissaries continue to press Cleopatra with offers. Plutarch records a meeting between Octavian and Cleopatra, in which Octavian assured her of dignity in Rome if she would walk in his triumph rather than be bound as a slave. The offer, to be paraded as a living symbol yet retained in some semblance of dignity, is a grim calculation. It seems to offer an alternative to being dragged in chains, but it also guarantees the appropriation of her personhood as imperial spectacle. Sources indicate that Octavian gave her time, a short interval, sometimes described as 3 days, to decide. These days were not a respite in the modern sense. They were part of a strategic delay intended to let the public narrative ferment, to allow the Roman propaganda machine to prepare images and tokens, and to continue the pressure by managing her environment. Whether Octavian truly intended to honor any private agreement is a matter of interpretation, and later evidence suggests that such promises can be hollow. The instrument of the offer was as much about appearances, about transforming a complex rival into a neat emblem, as it was about genuine mercy. August 9th-10. The days pass with more visitors and more preparations. According to some accounts, craftsmen measured the queen for ceremonial garments. Plans for her entourage and the order of procession were debated. Other reports underline the theatricality of the whole enterprise. Rome's artisans and officials were already rehearsing the story. At the same time, Cleopatra's alimentary regimen remained erratic. She continued to refuse food at times, signaling a refusal to be used as political theater. Plutarch's portrait of the queen in these moments is of dignity mixed with strategy. She is not merely a passive victim, but a political actor, calculating how to control what little she can of her fate. August 11th. Here the narrative turns toward what we might call the final act. Sources indicate that Cleopatra asked to visit Antony's tomb. Plutarch records this as a significant private pilgrimage. It is plausible, though not certain from the record, that in that tomb she arranged for a means to end her life on her own terms. Scholars debate whether she sealed a vial of poison beforehand, or contrived access to an animal. The popular image, her suicide by the bite of an asp, is vivid and has dominated the imagination for centuries, but the ancient textual evidence for a pair of snakes, or a single basket and asp scene, is thin and inconsistent. Plutarch narrates the asp story with appeal and drama, but other reliable accounts suggest poison delivered in a small cup or container is at least as credible. Strabo, for example, expresses skepticism towards some of the more picturesque anecdotes about the death. He is not convinced the snake story is the whole truth. To present the asp as definitive is to privilege a later poetic tradition over a complicated textual record. Thus we must treat the method of death as contested. It is indefinido in the sense that no forensic certainty exists, and ancient authors themselves offer multiple versions. Plausible reconstruction. Cleopatra, after visiting Antony's memorial, obtains a small instrument. Some accounts suggest an unseen vial, others a concealed puncturing device, and prepares herself to refuse the spectacle of being led in triumph. The distinction here matters. The Roman narrative required a living Cleopatra at the moment of capture in order to craft their images. A dead Cleopatra on Roman soil would upset the tableau. A dead Cleopatra discovered in Egypt, dressed and arranged, was a different problem. If we accept the sources that report Octavian wishing to present Cleopatra alive before the Roman people, then her secret preparation for death can be read as the only form of agency left to her, to control the manner in which her body entered the historical record. Whatever the material means, the broader act is clear across the sources. She planned an ending that refused the Roman script. August 12th. The final morning is recorded in similar outline by multiple sources. Cleopatra is found dead, regally attired. Eras, one of her handmaids, also lies dead at the foot of her couch. Charmian, another attendant, is found dying or already dead beside her. The presence of the attendants in death has inspired much speculation. Did they poison themselves to accompany their mistress? Did the deaths result from the same instrument? Were they forced into a fate to remove witnesses? Plutarch offers a narrative that suggests loyalty and tragic solidarity. Other sources complicate this picture with hints of coercion and ambiguity. The essential commonality is that Rome arrived to claim the spectacle of her demise. Cleopatra's choice presented as the final flourish to an otherwise tightly controlled political operation. After Cleopatra's body was found, Octavian moved swiftly to exploit the image. Rome required not merely the physical possession of Egypt, but a controlled story explaining why its leader had triumphed. In a triumph months later, Octavian paraded symbols of the East through the streets of Rome. Plutarch records that an effigy of Cleopatra was displayed among the spoils. The visual language of triumph made Cleopatra into a representation of Oriental decadence and defeat. Yet something else happened. Behind the ritual, the political culling continued. Caesarion, Cleopatra's eldest son, and the biological child of Julius Caesar, had a tenuous claim to Roman legitimacy by descent. According to Cassius Dio and other sources, Octavian ordered the assassination of Caesarion, eliminating a possible rival and sending a blunt message. The dynasty would not be tolerated. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, survived, but under Roman guardianship. They were paraded and then absorbed into the Roman system. Cleopatra Selene later married King Juba II of Mauritania and effectively became part of Rome's extended circle. The survival of the younger children was, in part, another calculation, useful as trophies and as tools of Roman propaganda, but harmless as future claimants. That Octavian's victory was as much about imagery as about arms is not a novel argument, but the particular mechanics exposed in these 10 days sharpen our understanding of how the spectacle of empire is made. The separation of children, the measurement of garments, the staged visits, and the calibrated offers of clemency are pieces of a deliberate program to produce a simplified public narrative. The asp myth, rhetorically perfect, was convenient to Roman taste. It made Cleopatra's death an act of feminine tragedy rather than an indictment of Roman cruelty. The myth redirected attention away from the systematic use of pressure and toward a sublime act of self-determined demise. In other words, the romance of the story obscured the horror of the political machinery that made that romance plausible. We must be careful, as historians, not to impose modern categories where they do not fit. When we describe Octavian's tactics as psychological strategy, we are interpreting patterns of action, separation, isolation, humiliation, through a modern lens. Those terms help us understand the intent and effect of Roman actions, but they are interpretive tools, not forensic proof. Likewise, the exact method of Cleopatra's death remains contested. Plutarch's aptitude for narrating the dramatic, Strabo's skepticism, and the silences of other contemporaries all counsel caution. The ASP story is memorable. Memory is not the same as accuracy. Yet even with those caveats, a few points are clear. First, Octavian had motive and means to manipulate the conditions of Cleopatra's confinement for propagandistic ends. Second, the Romans' treatment of her children demonstrates a cold calculus. Family ties were weaponized to influence political decisions. Third, the physical preparations, measurements for garments, debates about the manner in which she would be displayed, reveal a mindset that regarded captive bodies as political instruments. And fourth, whatever private dignity Cleopatra attempted to secure through her final act, Rome's subsequent representations of her death show the decisive power of narrative after the fact. Octavian gained not only a kingdom, but the right to tell its story. The aftermath should trouble anyone who thinks victory is purely material. Octavian's triumph reshaped the moral geography of the Mediterranean. He turned a civil conflict into a moral crusade, an Eastern story of excess to be shown off in Roman piety. The assassination of Caesarion erased a living claim that could have complicated Roman claims to legitimacy. The survival and later careers of Cleopatra's younger children were reduced to tokens in a larger imperial archive. Without controlling the story of Cleopatra's end, Octavian would have faced the risk that she might be remembered as more than a scenic emblem, as a sophisticated ruler, a participant in Roman politics, and the mother of potential claimants. By seizing the narrative, he made sure that history, at least the public, durable kind, would reflect Rome's order. Consider, then, what was overlooked. For centuries, readers and viewers have focused on the image of a queen choosing death with classical stoicism, an image that invites pity and aesthetic mourning. What tends to be neglected is the deliberate choreography that made that image plausible and photographable. The calculated stripping of allies, the use of children as pawns, the repeated measurement and rehearsal of display, the ambiguous offers of clemency that were simultaneously a trap. These are not small details. They are the mechanics of domination. They transform an individual tragedy into a political lesson about how emerging power consolidates itself through spectacle. They reveal that Cleopatra's death was as much a contest of narratives as it was of armies. Another overlooked detail is the moral dilemma Cleopatra faced. Dignity in death versus motherhood. Throughout Plutarch's account, and according to later commentators, she appears to be wrestling with a single, brutal calculus. Could she choose death as an assertion of agency without condemning her children? The sources suggest that she hoped her children might be spared if she complied with Roman demands. In practice, those hopes proved selective. Caesarion was eliminated. The younger ones were spared, but remade. That the instrumental use of family connections was a central lever in Octavian's strategy demonstrates the cruelty of imperial legitimation. To win consent and awe from Rome, he was willing to weaponize the most intimate human bonds. We must also reflect on what it means when stories harden into myth. The ASP narrative, whether the actual method used or an embellishment, offered a tidy moral of a queen's undying love and tragic autonomy. It is artistically compelling. But myths have political lives. They smooth over the indecorous features of conquest and provide an audience-friendly version of events. In this case, the myth served Rome's needs as well as later storytellers. It took the messy realities of manipulation and turned them into artful self-sacrifice. For historians, separating the plausibly intentional operation from the later myth is not an exercise in pedantry. It is a duty to render the texture of oppression visible. What then do we make of Cleopatra's final act? Was it defeat, or a last assertion of power? Plutarch frames it as a noble self-choice, a rejection of humiliation. That interpretation is defensible. Choosing death to deny your captor the spectacle of your life on display can be read as a powerful, autonomous statement. Yet that interpretation is incomplete if it ignores the conditions that made such a choice necessary. If Octavian's operation left only the narrow channel of self-determined death to protect dignity, then the act was both resistance and evidence of a larger triumph of coercion. Her death simultaneously denied Octavian a living trophy and allowed him to sculpt her story. In both outcomes, Septimius and the empire's power was affirmed. The ambiguity is the point. In the machinery of imperial spectacle, a private act of agency becomes public material for the victor. The meaning of Cleopatra's death depends as much on the action surrounding it as on the action itself. If we step back, the lesson extends beyond ancient Alexandria. The final days of Cleopatra expose how power operates through a mix of theater and administration. Take away allies, control family members, rehearse the image, offer conditional clemency, and then display the result as a moral victory. These techniques, physical as well as symbolic, are the building blocks of a narrative that legitimizes an emergent regime. Octavian's genius, for better and worse, was not simply martial, it was dramaturgical. He understood the ancient world's hunger for meaning in spectacle and used that hunger to anchor a new order. Let me be explicit about limits. We cannot claim with forensic certainty the exact instrument of Cleopatra's death. The asp may have bitten her. A vial of poison may have been the means. Some arrangement now lost to us could have been involved. The sources are contradictory. What is not contested is that Octavian controlled the sequence of events around her capture and that he used those events to produce an imperial story, where sources supply particular acts, capturing the children, arranging for measurements, giving a timed ultimatum. We rely on them and flag disputed attributions. Where silence or disagreement exists, we label statements as reconstruction or indefinido. Historical humility does not prevent moral clarity. The evidence supports the claim that Cleopatra's final days were systematically managed to serve Rome's narrative ends. We can frame a final, difficult question. If Cleopatra's last act denied Octavian the image of a living trophy, did it ultimately succeed as resistance, or did it merely supply him with a new, even more controllable symbol? There is no purely objective answer. The death denied Octavian the pleasure of parading a living queen, but it also offered him a tastier, more picturesque story to spin for generations. The elimination of Caesarion and the appropriation of Cleopatra's image in Roman triumphs showed that narrative control, once won, could convert private acts into public proof of dominance. History has often preferred romance to method because romance simplifies moral complexity. The asp story comforts and consoles. The evidence of systematic manipulation unsettles. That is precisely why it has been overlooked. The theatricality of Roman triumph and the seductive image of a queen's noble suicide displaced the more mundane but morally important facts. That children were used as bargaining chips, that physical measures prepared a body for display, that promises were strategized to induce compliance. These are the horrific details history overlooked. Not lurid because of gore, but horrific because they reveal how political power instrumentalizes intimacy and dignity. When you imagine the sealed room again, imagine not only the queen, but the small tools of policy, a measuring rod, a messenger's robe, the quiet footsteps of officials. Those are the less dramatic but more revealing instruments of conquest. Cleopatra's life and death remind us that the most effective forms of domination are often those that arrive clothed as magnanimity and appear as mercy. The final image, splashy and indelible though it is, masks a slow work of dismantlement. So how should we remember Cleopatra? As a tragic romantic figure, as a victim of imperial malice, as a shrewd political actor who seized the only form of autonomy left to her, or as all of these? The answer matters because it shapes how we read empires, confront their images, and understand the price of political legitimacy. She was a ruler educated in multiple cultures, fluent in the politics of Rome and Egypt. Her death is both a story of personal sovereignty and a case study in how emerging powers use spectacle to naturalize themselves. Was Cleopatra's final choice victory, defeat, or both? I invite you to weigh the evidence, consider the sources, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, Strabo, and tell us what you think in the comments. If this examination of how power manufactures meaning matters to you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives into the mechanics that shape history's most enduring images.